What if the most frightening part of the Nephilim story isn't what happened while the giants were alive? What if the real mystery begins after they died? For centuries, people have argued about who the Nephilim actually were. Were they giants? Were they the offspring of the mysterious Watchers? Were they something else entirely? And why does the ancient Book of Enoch spend so much time describing what happened to them? But there's one detail in Enoch's account that is far more disturbing than their enormous size. The giants die, but according to Enoch, something comes out of them. Something that remains on earth. Something that doesn't live like a human being. Something that Enoch says can afflict, oppress, attack, and cause destruction among humanity. And if you've ever wondered why the Book of Enoch became so controversial, this is one of the passages you need to understand. Because Enoch's story doesn't end with the destruction of the giants. It continues. And what comes next may completely change the way you understand the ancient story of the Watchers, Nephilim, fallen angels, and the world before the flood. But before we get there, we need to go back to the beginning. Because the giants didn't simply appear. According to 1 Enoch, something came down from heaven first. The text describes the mysterious Watchers, heavenly beings who saw the daughters of men and desired them. They descended to earth. They took human women as wives. And their union produced children described as great giants. But these weren't peaceful giants living quietly among humanity. Enoch describes them consuming the resources produced by human beings until people could no longer sustain them. Then the giants turned against humanity. They began killing and devouring people. And the violence didn't stop there. Enoch says they also attacked birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish. The entire world seemed to be caught inside the consequences of this rebellion. And that gives us our first major clue. The Nephilim story isn't simply about big people. It's about a world in which the boundaries between heaven, humanity, and creation itself have been violated. And once those boundaries were broken, something entered the world that wasn't supposed to remain. If you're enjoying these deep investigations into the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the ancient mysteries surrounding the world before the flood, subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because in this channel, we don't just look at the familiar stories. We go into the strange passages, the forgotten passages, and the passages that raise questions most people never think to ask. And the biggest question in this story is coming. What happened to the Nephilim after their bodies were destroyed? Because according to Enoch, their story didn't end with their death. It was only beginning. The most important question isn't how big the Nephilim were. It's this. What happened to them when they died? Because according to the Book of Enoch, their death did not simply erase their existence. To understand why, we have to look at what Enoch says about their origin. The Watchers were heavenly beings who abandoned their proper dwelling and descended to earth. They took human women as wives, and from that union came the giants. Enoch describes the giants as beings produced from spirit and flesh. And that description is crucial. Because the giants themselves occupy a strange position. They aren't presented as ordinary humans. They aren't presented as ordinary heavenly beings either. Their existence is the result of a forbidden crossing between two different orders of creation. And the consequences of that crossing become catastrophic. Enoch describes the giants consuming what humanity produced until people could no longer feed them. Then they turned against human beings and began devouring them. Their violence eventually spread beyond humanity. The ancient text describes them attacking birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish as well. Imagine the world Enoch is describing. Human civilization is being overwhelmed. The creatures of the earth are being attacked. The boundaries of creation appear to be collapsing. And somewhere above all of this, the heavenly realm is watching. Until finally, judgment comes. But here's where the story takes a turn most people completely miss. The giants can be destroyed. Their flesh can perish. But Enoch says something comes from them after their bodies are gone. Their spirits. Chapter 15 gives an extraordinary explanation. The giants are to be called evil spirits on the earth, because spirits have gone forth from their bodies. Their dwelling is on earth. Think about that for a moment. The giants die, but the story doesn't end. Something survives. Something invisible. Something that doesn't require the same physical existence as the giants themselves. And Enoch says these spirits don't simply sit quietly in the shadows. He describes them as beings that afflict, oppress, attack, fight, and cause destruction on the earth. They don't eat ordinary food. They aren't described as ordinary physical creatures. And yet, according to the text, they continue to trouble humanity. This is where the ancient account becomes genuinely fascinating. Because if the giants were the physical consequence of the Watchers' rebellion, then the spirits were the continuing consequence. The bodies disappeared. The presence remained. And Enoch says their activity continues until something called the Great Judgment. So when people ask, what happened to the Nephilim? The answer in 1 Enoch isn't simply, they died. It's more complicated. Their physical existence ended. But according to Enoch's theology, something associated with them remained upon the earth. And that raises another question. Why would God allow these spirits to remain after the giants were destroyed? Was their continued existence part of the judgment? Were they permitted to remain only for a limited period? And why does Enoch say their final destruction is connected with the consummation of the age? Because the Watchers didn't just create giants. They introduced something into the world that Enoch portrays as continuing long after their rebellion had been punished. And if you're enjoying this deeper look at what the Book of Enoch actually says about the Nephilim, Watchers, giants, and evil spirits, subscribe to the 9th tablet. We're going much deeper than the usual Nephilim stories, because the next part is where Enoch reveals what these spirits actually do to humanity, and why the ancient text describes their activity in terms that sound remarkably different from the way most people imagine demons today. The giants may have disappeared, but according to Enoch, their influence had not. Now we reach the part of the Book of Enoch that makes the story much darker. Because Enoch doesn't merely say that the spirits of the giants remain. He tells us what they do. And the language is remarkably direct. They afflict. They oppress. They attack. They fight. They cause destruction. And they bring trouble upon the earth. These aren't described as physical giants walking through ancient cities. They're described as spirits. Invisible beings whose origin is connected to the giants and, ultimately, to both human beings and the Watchers. And Enoch gives them a strange characteristic. He says they take no food. They hunger and thirst, yet they don't live like ordinary physical creatures. Think about the implication. The giants once had bodies. They could eat. They could attack. They could be seen. But after their destruction, what remained was something fundamentally different. Something without the same physical limitations. And according to Enoch, these spirits turn their attention toward humanity. The text says they rise against the sons of men and against women because they came from humanity in the first place. That is one of the strangest details in the entire account. The spirits aren't simply random demons appearing from nowhere. Their origin is tied directly to the ancient rebellion. The Watchers crossed the boundary. The giants were produced. The giants were destroyed. And from their bodies came spirits that continued to trouble the earth. So the physical giants may have disappeared, but the consequences of their existence continued. And here's where I want you to pay attention. The Book of Enoch does not say that these spirits literally feed on human emotions. It doesn't say they harvest fear, anger, grief, or suffering as some kind of supernatural energy. That's an interpretation found in some modern discussions, not what the text itself actually says. What Enoch does say is arguably disturbing enough. These spirits afflict humanity. They attack. They oppress. They cause destruction. And they continue their activity until the final judgment. So when we talk about the Nephilim in this video, we're not talking about a simple story where giants existed, giants died, end of story. According to Enoch, there's a second chapter. The body disappears, but the spirit remains. And that distinction may explain why the ancient tradition continued to associate the Nephilim story with demons and evil spirits long after the giants themselves were gone. But now another question appears. If these spirits were allowed to remain on earth, why wouldn't the same judgment that destroyed the giants immediately destroy their spirits? Why would Enoch describe them as continuing their destructive work until a future event? And what exactly is this great judgment that finally brings their activity to an end? Because Enoch gives us an answer. And it takes us directly into one of the most important ideas in the entire story. The spirits were never given unlimited time. Their activity has a deadline. Their destruction has an appointed moment. And according to Enoch, that moment is connected to the consummation of the age, the great judgment in which the watchers, the godless, and the remaining consequences of their rebellion are finally dealt with. So the story isn't simply about what survived. It's about how long it was allowed to survive. And that distinction is crucial. Because if you're wondering whether the Book of Enoch teaches that these spirits are still active today, we have to be careful. Enoch says they remain until the Great Judgment. But the text itself does not give us a modern date, location, or scientific proof that identifies specific present-day events with these spirits. What it gives us is an ancient worldview, a warning, and a timeline. The spirits remain. The judgment is coming. And their story ends there. If you're enjoying this deeper investigation into what the Book of Enoch actually says about the Nephilim and the spirits that came from them, make sure you subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because we're about to connect this mystery to something much bigger. The spirits weren't the only thing the Watchers left behind. They also left humanity with forbidden knowledge. And Enoch says that knowledge itself helped multiply evil on earth. So the next question becomes even more disturbing. What exactly did the Watchers teach humanity? And why was that knowledge considered so dangerous? The Nephilim weren't the only thing the Watchers brought into the world. According to 1 Enoch, they also brought something that humanity had never been meant to receive in that way. Forbidden knowledge. And this is where the story becomes much bigger than giants. Because Enoch gives us something unusual. A list. Not a vague description. A list of the things different Watchers allegedly taught humanity. Azazel is said to have taught humans how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He also taught them about metals, ornaments, precious stones, cosmetics, and dyes. Other Watchers are associated with enchantments, the cutting of roots, the releasing of spells, astrology, the constellations, signs of the earth, the sun, the moon, and the clouds. Now here's where we need to be careful. Enoch isn't necessarily saying that every one of these subjects is inherently evil. Metallurgy isn't evil. Astronomy isn't evil. Understanding plants isn't evil. Even making clothing, jewelry, or cosmetics isn't automatically evil. The disturbing part of Enoch's story is where this knowledge came from and how it was introduced into humanity. The Watchers were supposed to remain in their heavenly order. Instead, they crossed the boundary. Then they revealed secrets that the text presents as forbidden. And according to Enoch, the result was devastating. The world became increasingly corrupt. Violence multiplied. Human beings suffered. And the cries of those being destroyed eventually reached heaven. Think about the pattern. First, the Watchers descend. Then, the giants appear. Then, the forbidden knowledge spreads. Then, violence consumes the earth. And finally, heaven responds. That's the larger story Enoch is telling. The Nephilim weren't an isolated phenomenon. They were part of a chain reaction. A rebellion begins in heaven. It crosses into the human world. It changes humanity. It produces giants. The giants produce destruction. And when the giants are destroyed, Enoch says their spirits remain to afflict humanity. The consequences keep moving forward. That's why the idea of the Nephilim is so important in Enoch. They aren't simply mysterious giants from an ancient story. They represent the consequences of a boundary being crossed. And that may explain why the text spends so much time describing the knowledge the Watchers introduced. Because the real danger wasn't only what they created. It was what they taught. And here's something fascinating. One of the Watchers is specifically associated with weapons and metallurgy. Another with enchantments. Others with celestial signs and movements. So Enoch presents the Watchers almost like teachers. But teachers who gave humanity knowledge before humanity was supposed to have it. And the result wasn't enlightenment. According to the text, the world was changed. If you're enjoying this deeper investigation into the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, the Nephilim, forbidden knowledge, and the world before the flood, make sure you subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because we're about to connect these pieces. The giants were destroying humanity. The Watchers were corrupting humanity. And heaven was receiving the cries of the victims. So the question becomes, what did heaven do about it? Because Enoch says several heavenly beings looked down, saw the bloodshed, and realized that something had gone terribly wrong. And what they did next would set in motion the judgment of the Watchers, and eventually the destruction of the world they had helped create. The cries had reached heaven. Enoch says that the archangels Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel looked down and saw the bloodshed and lawlessness covering the earth. And what they saw wasn't something they could simply ignore. The souls of those who had been killed were crying out. Their lamentations had reached the gates of heaven, and the heavenly beings brought the matter before the Most High. Then, the response came. But it wasn't simply a command to destroy the giants. The judgment was much larger. First, Noah was warned. Uriel was sent to Noah, the son of Lamech, with a message that a great deluge was approaching. The earth would be destroyed by the coming waters, but Noah and his seed would be preserved. Then another command was given. Raphael was sent after Azazel, the watcher associated with teaching humanity weapons, metals, and other forbidden knowledge, was to be bound hand and foot and thrown into a place called Dudiel. He was to be covered in darkness and remain there until the appointed judgment. But the giants were dealt with differently. Gabriel was commanded to go against the offspring of the Watchers and cause them to destroy one another. Their existence would not continue indefinitely. Their enormous bodies, their violence, their rebellion, would come to an end. And then came the punishment of the Watchers themselves. Michael was commanded to bind Simjaza and his associates and hold them in the valleys of the earth until the appointed judgment. Look at the sequence. Noah is warned. Azazel is imprisoned. The giants are destroyed. The Watchers are bound. And the earth is prepared for cleansing. This is why the flood in 1 Enoch is more than simply a story about rain and rising water. Within Enoch's narrative, the flood becomes the divine response to a world corrupted by the Watchers, their teachings, and the violence of their offspring. But remember the question we started with. What happened to the Nephilim? We now know what happened to their bodies. They were destroyed. But that's not the end, because Enoch says something remained. Their spirits. And those spirits were not destroyed alongside the flesh. They remained upon the earth. They continued to afflict humanity, and they were allowed to remain until the great judgment. So the flood didn't simply erase every consequence of the Watchers' rebellion. Something survived the destruction. Something invisible. Something that Enoch says would continue until the final reckoning. And that changes the entire Nephilim story. Because perhaps the question isn't, where are the giants? Maybe the more important question is, what did the giants leave behind? If you're enjoying this investigation into the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim, Watchers, fallen angels, and the mysteries surrounding the world before the flood, make sure you subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because we're getting to the part of the story that most retellings leave out. The giants were destroyed. The Watchers were imprisoned. The flood came. But something remained. And Enoch tells us exactly what that something was, and what would eventually happen to it. The final judgment had already been announced. It was only a matter of time before everything left behind by the Watchers would face it. The flood came. The world that had been corrupted by the Watchers and their offspring was judged. The giants were destroyed. The Watchers were bound. And Noah and his family were preserved. At first glance, it seems like the story should end there. The rebellion is over. The giants are gone. The earth has been cleansed. But according to the Book of Enoch, there is a problem. The spirits of the giants remain. Enoch 15 describes these spirits as having come forth from the bodies of the giants and dwelling upon the earth. It says they afflict, oppress, attack, and cause destruction. So the flood destroyed the physical world of the giants. But it didn't erase every consequence of their existence. And this is where the Nephilim story becomes much more interesting. Because we're no longer talking about enormous beings walking through the ancient world. We're talking about something invisible. Something Enoch says does not live like ordinary flesh. Something that continues to operate after the physical giants are gone. And notice what Enoch says next. Their activity has a limit. Chapter 16 says that after the death of the giants, the spirits that came from their flesh would continue their destructive activity until the great judgment. That means Enoch's story has a timeline. The Watchers rebel. The giants appear. The world becomes corrupt. Judgment comes. The giants die. Their spirits emerge. And those spirits continue until another judgment. So the flood wasn't necessarily the final chapter. It was one judgment within a much larger story. And this distinction matters because modern retellings sometimes make the flood sound like a magical reset button, as if everything connected to the Watchers simply disappeared beneath the water. But that's not what this section of Enoch says. The text specifically continues the story after the giants' destruction. Their physical bodies are gone, but the spirits remain. And Enoch connects their eventual destruction with the consummation of the age, the great judgment that will finally bring the Watchers and the godless to their appointed end. Now think about what that means for the title of this video. What happened to the Nephilim? The answer isn't simply, they were killed. It's, their bodies were destroyed, but Enoch says something associated with them continued. And that's the part that makes this ancient account so different from the popular Nephilim stories circulating today. The mystery isn't necessarily where the giants are hiding. The mystery is what remained after they were gone. And if you're enjoying this deeper investigation into the Book of Enoch, Nephilim, Watchers, fallen angels, and the ancient world before the flood, make sure you subscribe to the 9th tablet, because we're about to go one level deeper. If the spirits remained after the giants died, what were they actually trying to do? Were they simply wandering spirits? Were they continuing the rebellion of the Watchers? Or does Enoch give us a specific reason they continued to target humanity? Because the next part takes us back to the very beginning, to the strange connection between the giants, human beings, and the spirits that came from them. And once you understand that connection, the ancient explanation for these beings becomes even more disturbing. Now we come to a question the Book of Enoch does not answer in the way modern theories often claim. What did these spirits actually want? Did they feed on fear? Did they consume human suffering? Did they harvest emotions? The Book of Enoch doesn't say that. And that's important. Because if we're going to investigate this ancient text, we need to separate what Enoch actually says from what later interpretations have added to the story. What Enoch does say is disturbing enough. The spirits of the giants are described as beings that afflict, oppress, attack, fight, and cause destruction on earth. They rise against human beings because they came from humanity and the Watchers. So Enoch gives us their behavior, but not a detailed explanation of their psychological motives. And perhaps that's precisely what makes the passage so fascinating. Because the ancient author isn't interested in telling us. Here is exactly what these spirits feel. He's telling us, here is what they do. They cause trouble. They attack. They corrupt. They bring destruction. And they remain on earth. But there's another detail that deserves our attention. Enoch says these spirits do not eat food. Yet they are described as hungry and thirsty. Whatever the exact meaning of that statement, the author clearly wants us to understand that these beings aren't operating like ordinary physical creatures. They're associated with the giants, but they're no longer giants. They're spirits, and their existence is tied to a strange contradiction. They have no ordinary body, yet they continue to affect the physical world. That's the mystery. The giants had flesh. The spirits don't. The giants could be destroyed. The spirits remain. And according to chapter 16, they continue their destructive activity until the Great Judgment. So there is something else we need to understand. The spirits aren't presented as independent gods. They aren't presented as eternal beings with unlimited power. Their existence has a boundary, judgment. And that distinction is incredibly important. Because the Book of Enoch repeatedly presents the Watchers and their offspring as beings who crossed boundaries that were never theirs to cross. The Watchers abandoned their heavenly position. They took human wives. They produced giants. They revealed mysteries. And those mysteries contributed to evil spreading across the earth. Then came judgment. The Watchers were condemned. The giants were destroyed. And the spirits remained for a limited period. In other words, the rebellion was never outside God's control. It may have caused devastation. It may have changed the world. But Enoch's story never presents it as an equal battle between two opposing powers. There is no suggestion that the Watchers can ultimately defeat God. Their rebellion has a beginning. Their punishment has been announced. And their final judgment has already been determined. That's a very different picture from the idea that evil spirits are somehow feeding indefinitely on human suffering because they possess unlimited power. Enoch doesn't say that. What it does say is arguably more chilling. Something born from the ancient corruption of the Watchers remains on earth, and it has been permitted to operate until judgment. If you're enjoying these deeper investigations into what the Book of Enoch actually says about the Nephilim, Watchers, fallen angels, giants, and evil spirits, make sure you subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because now we have one final piece to uncover. We've talked about what happened to the giants. We've talked about the spirits that came from them. We've talked about the forbidden knowledge the Watchers introduced. And we've talked about the judgment waiting for all of them. But there's still one question. Why does this ancient story continue to matter? Because Enoch isn't simply telling us that strange beings once existed. He's presenting a warning about what happens when boundaries are crossed, when forbidden knowledge is embraced, and when corruption spreads beyond the people who first created it. And once you see that pattern, the story of the Nephilim becomes much bigger than a story about giants. It becomes a story about what survives after destruction. And that's where we're going next. So we've reached the point where we can finally answer the question at the center of this entire investigation. What remained after the Nephilim died? According to 1 Enoch, the answer isn't another race of giants. It isn't a hidden tribe. And it isn't a surviving physical species. It was their spirits. Enoch describes the giants as being produced from spirit and flesh, and says that when they are destroyed, spirits proceed from their bodies. Those spirits are then described as evil spirits whose dwelling is on earth. And Enoch doesn't leave their behavior mysterious. He says these spirits afflict, oppress, attack, fight, and cause destruction. They rise against humanity. And, according to the text, they remain active until the Great Judgment. That gives us something very important. The Nephilim story has 3 stages. First, the Watchers descend. Then, the giants are born. And finally, the giants are destroyed but the spirits remain. The physical manifestation disappears. The spiritual consequence continues. And that is probably the most important detail in the entire story. Because when we hear the word Nephilim, most people immediately picture enormous beings walking across an ancient landscape. But Enoch's account eventually moves beyond the giants themselves. It becomes a story about what their existence left behind. And there's another fascinating detail. The spirits aren't described as eternal beings with unlimited freedom. Their activity has a boundary, a deadline, the Great Judgment. Enoch says they will continue to destroy until the consummation, the Great Judgment in which the age is brought to its appointed end. So even in this strange ancient worldview, evil isn't portrayed as having the final word. The Watchers crossed their boundary. The giants brought destruction. The spirits continued the damage. But judgment had already been determined. And this is where I want to return to the title. What remained after they died? Now we know. Not the giants themselves. Not necessarily a surviving physical species. But according to Enoch, the spirits that came from them. And that is a far stranger idea than simply imagining a giant hiding somewhere in the modern world. Because a physical creature can be seen. A physical creature can be measured. A physical creature can eventually die. But Enoch's spirits belong to a completely different category. They're invisible. They don't live like human beings. And yet the text attributes real effects to them. That's why this ancient passage has fascinated readers for centuries. Not because it proves that Nephilim are secretly walking among us today. It doesn't. But because it presents an ancient explanation for how the consequences of the Watchers' rebellion could continue even after the giants themselves had disappeared. And there is one final detail we cannot ignore. Enoch connects their fate with judgment. The spirits remain. But they don't remain forever. Their story has an ending. And when that final judgment arrives, the same rebellion that began with the Watchers crossing from heaven into the human world finally reaches its conclusion. So perhaps the most frightening lesson of the Nephilim story isn't, giants once walked the earth. Perhaps it's this. What is created by rebellion can outlive the rebellion itself. The Watchers were judged. The giants were destroyed. But their consequences continued. And if you're enjoying these investigations into the Book of Enoch, Nephilim, Watchers, Fallen Angels, Giants, and Ancient Biblical Mysteries, make sure you subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because this isn't the end of the story. We've only answered what happened to the Nephilim. Now we need to ask something even bigger. Why did Enoch preserve this story in the first place? What was he actually trying to warn humanity about? And when we look beyond the giants, beyond the Watchers, and beyond the spirits, we discover that the Book of Enoch may have been making a much larger statement about knowledge, corruption, judgment, and the boundaries between heaven and earth. And that's where the real mystery begins. And now we can finally answer the question: what happened to the Nephilim? According to the Book of Enoch, their physical existence came to an end. The giants were destroyed. But Enoch says their spirits remained upon the earth. And those spirits were associated with affliction, oppression, attack, and destruction until the appointed judgment. That's the part of the story that is often left out. The giants weren't the final chapter. They were the beginning of something that continued after them. But there's another lesson here. The Book of Enoch does not actually say that these spirits literally harvest human emotions or farm suffering. That is a modern interpretation. What Enoch actually gives us is something more restrained and arguably more fascinating. A story about a forbidden crossing. Heavenly beings crossed into the human world. Their actions produced catastrophic consequences. The giants were destroyed, and something associated with them remained. The body disappeared. The consequence remained, asterisk asterisk. And perhaps that's why the ancient writer preserved this story. Not simply to make us wonder whether giants once walked the earth, but to warn us about what can happen when boundaries are crossed and corruption is allowed to spread. The Watchers were judged. The Nephilim were destroyed. The spirits were given a limited period. And ultimately, judgment comes for everything. So if you came here wondering whether the Book of Enoch says the Nephilim are still physically alive somewhere today, the text doesn't give us that. But it does give us something far stranger. It says that although the giants disappeared, their story did not. And if you want more investigations into the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, Nephilim, fallen angels, ancient mysteries, and the strange beings described in forgotten texts, subscribe to the 9th tablet. Because there are still passages in these ancient books that most people have never heard explained. And the next mystery may take us somewhere even more disturbing. What did the Watchers know before they came to Earth? And why were those secrets considered forbidden? Until then, keep questioning what you think you know. The 9th tablet, where the forgotten stories are opened.